So hello everybody, welcome to this new lunch lecture. Thank you for being here today. I am Sabri Darinas and I will be hosting today's lunch lecture about visual misinformation during election times. And I am happy to welcome Bart Cammaerts, who will present preliminary results in a few minutes. But first, let's talk about EDMO and the lunch lecture. So EDMO, as most of you know, is the European Digital Media Observatory, which brings together fact checkers, journalists, experts, media literacy experts, and academic researchers to tackle, fight, or understand better disinformation. And so there are different hubs, and within EDMO BELUX is the hub that focuses on Belgium and Luxembourg. So within that context, we organize several lunch lectures, which is a series of webinars about disinformation and disinformation mitigation or related topics. So today we will listen to Bart Cammaerts. He's a professor of politics and communication at the London School of Economics and Political Science. And his research focuses on the relationship between media, communication, and resistance. And today he will present an ongoing research that he is doing with his colleague of the LSE, Nick Anstead. And the research is about the exposure to visual misinformation on social media during election in several countries such as Belgium, France, etc. And it will take a special look at AI-generated content. So the preliminary findings that are presented today are based on mostly on a content analysis, but it is also complemented with an interview with experts. The presentation will be about 30-40 minutes long, and it will be followed by a discussion. So everyone that is here today, feel free to react and ask a written question in the dedicated space in the chat. And I will use these comments to feed the discussion at the end. So Bart, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you also for the invitation to talk in your seminar series. Yeah, so seeing is believing ? And we'll get back to that later as to why we chose that particular title. But obviously, the context of our research project was that 2024 was called by some as the year of elections. It involved 72 countries and potentially 3.7 billion citizens voting in new governments. But at the same time, we also had a lot of concerns and a lot of kind of questions that were raised in relation to the health of democratic institutions and also the very process of organizing elections and the media and communication environment that surrounds these elections. And obviously misinformation and disinformation was central to these concerns. Also foreign influence, for example, a lot of kind of articles and security services for that matter, highlighting the potential of disruption of these electoral processes through foreign influence. And obviously on top of that, we also then had in the run-up to the 2024 kind of election cycle, the launch of generative AI tools that heighten these worries even further. For example, the kind of this kind of article of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace: Can Democracy Survive the Disruptive Power of AI? There was also kind of like early examples of that were used in the run-up of these elections to show the kind of, and this was one that was posted by the British activist or fascist Tommy Robinson on the 80th anniversary of D-Day. And he was then, of course, mocked because the soldiers appeared to be running into the sea rather than towards the land. What we also wanted to look at was the particular role, as Sabri already kind of mentioned, the particular role of visual misinformation rather than textual misinformation. And we have here a few quotes from our interviews, kind of like it's rare that people or projects study visual contents or video content only. And I think that says a lot, because I feel it's understudied, and it's understudied because it's precisely difficult to study. And I'll come back to that in a minute, pointing to these difficulties also in terms of collecting data in that regard. A British journalist kind of made the observation that visual disinformation matters because it's so much more evocative, it's so much more emotional, and to be fair, also much more shareable in the kind of social media context that we live in. So what we actually did, we did two things. One was a content analysis in the run-up to these elections in Belgium, France, the UK, and the United States, of media kind of discourses around AI, and that is not necessarily part of this presentation, but it kind of set the stage for heightened concerns around the use of AI in these electoral processes. But we also wanted to kind of then subsequently have a look at what is actually happening in the different countries around the circulation of visual misinformation. So we got ethics approval from the LSC to set up dummy accounts in each of these countries, one more focusing on the political radical left, and the other more focusing on the political extreme right. And we were allowed to follow and like parties and figures and politicians and influencers in these two ideological kind of spheres. But what we were not allowed to do was to kind of make that account very active in terms of liking content, sharing content. So that's already a caveat that we need to kind of be careful about, that we might have missed certain things. And the other thing that we did is we kind of had a quite broad definition of visual misinformation, and I know that within the world of scholars and practitioners and fact checkers, that there is a debate about what is now real misinformation. But we deliberately took the view that we wanted to capture instances of visual misinformation by also including misleading information, misleading statistics, slander, exaggerations, etc. It's important to note that because of also the panic that was created to some degree by security services in the run-up to these elections, and also the pressure that was put on these kind of platforms, that there would also, that it's kind of also possible that we missed certain things, or that certain things were deleted by the platforms themselves. So it's important to note that the data that we gathered is not necessarily exhaustive or representative. It offers a snapshot. It offers us a kind of window into what was circulating in these different countries in terms of visual misinformation. But we don't claim that that data is kind of like totally representative of everything that kind of circulated or was exhaustive for that matter. We've also done a number of elite interviews. We have now done 6. I think there's another 3 or 4 that are in the pipeline to understand better understand our data, and to also corroborate certain of our findings or contest them or nuance them. So to quickly go through this in terms of the data that we gathered. We had the Belgian elections at the 9th of June. We had the French elections almost a month later. And also a month later was the UK elections. And then in November, we had the US elections. And we had a data gathering period of about a few months before the elections. So what we gathered was this kind of, you can see here that obviously the US and the UK had much more data. There wasn't that much, and that's also been corroborated by a lot of the interviews that we did, that contrary to the expectations, certainly in Belgium and France, there wasn't that much information circulating. I think even some of the kind of fact-checking organizations in France didn't even publish a report because there was so little kind of circulating at that time. In terms of the platforms, we looked at Instagram, Facebook, X, and TikTok. It's kind of interesting to note that we did for the US also add Truth Social, but we were kicked off Truth Social quite quickly, so we weren't able to gather that much content from Truth Social, probably because our account was dormant or was not really very active, that they kind of weed out these accounts on Truth Social to avoid people snooping on what is happening on that platform, I assume. So these are the kind of like, let's say, raw numbers. In terms of percentages, we can see that there are some differences in terms of what is used in different countries as main platforms, or where we found more on, for example, in Belgium, more on Instagram and X. Similar pattern in France, whereas there's more of a spread in the UK and the US. In terms of ideology, and that's obviously something that is also very clear in our data, but also in the interviews, that there is much more visual misinformation circulating in the extreme right-wing sphere than there is in the extreme or radical left sphere. The UK was a bit of an outlier in that regard, that we did see more left-wing accounts also active in terms of distributing and circulating visual misinformation. If we then look at the themes, in the first column is all the data, but then it gets subdivided in the different countries, and then we also have a column with the left-right kind of like distinction. But what we are seeing is that a lot of content, and we'll come back to that, is obviously about critiquing your opponent. But there is also, and that's especially the case in the UK and the US, a lot of mocking and ridiculing and focusing on gaffes. There's also quite a few, certainly in the US, the slandering of opponents. And unsurprisingly, and that was more pronounced in Belgium than anywhere else, and as of course, especially the extreme right sphere, using a lot of misinformation to bring attention to Islamophobia or anti-immigration standpoints. Nationalism was also, and jingoism was also, and certainly in the US and the UK, but France as well, actually, a lot of kind of nationalism and jingoism that was there. Not so much on election fraud, but that was especially obviously something that was a topic in the US much more than in other countries. Belgium also had a lot of kind of critique on the media. What was also surprising, I guess, is although trans issues were very prominent in campaigns, it was much less prominent in the circulation of misinformation. Belgium was a little bit an exception on that, but it was still kind of minor compared to other themes that were. What we also did, because a lot of this misinformation often combined different themes, we had a main theme and a secondary theme, and this data is bringing together all these themes. Then seeing is believing. A lot of the concerns that were voiced in 2024 before these elections was the realism or the danger of generative AI as visual misinformation, that this kind of potential for producing realist images was a genuine threat. And one of our questions was how sustainable is that assumption in these actual elections? So we have here the Center for Policy Studies. 3 weeks out from polling day, a new report warns of the danger of realistic fake footage that is cheap to create and spread across the internet, impacting the UK general elections. We must say that this didn't really materialize that much. Let's first look at the types of visual information. So some of them were AI generated, others were more photo doctored images rather than AI generated. And here we see that the US kind of has much more generated AI images than anything else. But as we also said, there's was also a lot of satirical and humorous content. So 70% of the content in Belgium was satirical or humorous, but 52% of that was satirical and humorous in the UK. Also, about 50% of the content in the UK made references to what we could generally call meme culture. This is also to some extent in Belgium, France, and the US, but less pronounced than in the UK context. There is obviously also in that regard, I think, and that's something that we're kind of also double checking with our expert interviews. There's also kind of an issue there in terms of political culture. I think humor and satire is something that is much more embedded in a UK context. It doesn't get used that much in a Belgian or a French political context. We also had a variable where we looked at to which extent the visual misinformation is credible, somewhat credible, or not credible at all. And these are obviously judgments that are made. We did do some intercaller reliability to make sure that these variables were stable. But overall, what we were seeing is that the large majority of the content, and that's especially in Europe, less so in the US. So in the US, we saw quite an increase in credible and somewhat credible content that was produced and circulated. And we could also maybe think of more involvement of professional kind of actors there to produce that kind of content. But the vast majority of content in the European context was not necessarily that credible in terms of what was circulating. Also, this kind of issue of credibility and non-credibility doesn't necessarily shift that much when we differentiate between non-AI and AI generated content, but it does in the context of the US, where the AI generated content is much more credible and deceptive, let's say, in that regard. Some of the kind of examples, these are examples of more credible kind of or believable kind of images that were of course fake. One in the US, one in the UK with Jimmy Savile, kind of in the meantime deceased pedophile that is depicted here with Keir Starmer. But there's also kind of like these kind of images where the credibility is kind of less an image, less an issue. There was this kind of...
So today I had the brilliant idea of joining Rishi's Minecraft server while he was offline, just to have a bit of fun and mess with him. So after exploring the world for a bit, I've actually stumbled upon his house. So naturally, I filled it to the brim with TNT. And for everyone's information, there were absolutely no trace of Sky TV services in or around the house. Wait, what does this say? Nigel, if this is you, do not grief my house. Well, sorry, Rishi. I think you can agree. It's too late for that, my friend. Anyway.
So this was Nigel Farage, kind of like also, again, fake depiction. So what the point that we wanted to also, I mean, the more we kind of saw this, we also more and more came to the conclusion that maybe this realism is not really that essential, not really that important. So that it's not because it's not realistic that it therefore cannot be problematic democratically or problematic in terms of what circulates or which audiences are being targeted. So here you have a researcher in the US working on this intersection of misinformation and democracy. Realism is not the point, they say. It's not a danger, you know. It can be a danger in certain circumstances, but it's not the thing that we should hyperfixate on, because it's never really the actual threat. It's more the propaganda threat that is the threat. Similarly, Belgian academic expert, most misinformation is not credible at all. It doesn't mean that it doesn't pose other kinds of risks. And in this regard, obviously, people that are being targeted by that information, it's quite emotive content. They are not necessarily looking for truth or for facts or credible things. If that visual misinformation fits their particular narrative, they will kind of share it. They will kind of take that on board. And also the narrative kind of in this regard obviously matters in terms of whether people feel that content resonates with them. I don't think that domestic sources of misinformation and disinformation did actually play a role in the UK context, quite a significant role, but I do think that these sources did play a role in helping amplify misleading narratives. So it's kind of like more doubling up. Many kind of US journalists and researchers, many narratives that have, existed in a stew of online discourse that are central to our politics in the US and elsewhere in the world. And in some ways, those narratives are powerful, and they do, play into election outcomes. And this kind of policy advisor in France, we've seen this over and over for years. We've looked at, for instance, anti-Muslim narratives, anti-Muslim sentiments. There was so much content. It was really on a very professional level. You could tell that every day they had an editorial line. So it's kind of disinformation is effective if it builds on established political narratives that are already circulating and just reinforces them. And therefore, credibility is not necessarily that important. The nature of the network varies across different national contexts. If we conclude here, Belgium and France look very different, less decentralized. We also noticed, for example, that a lot of the content that was circulate or visual misinformation that was circulating in France and Belgium emanates more from official accounts, more from extreme right politicians, for example, some of the extreme left as well, less so from more kind of opaque sources, let's say. In the US and the UK, it's much more decentralized, and it doesn't necessarily come, except maybe a little bit from Farage and the extreme right in the UK, but it comes much less from official accounts. The right appears to be generating more visual misinformation than the left, which is also findings of other studies. And a significant amount of misleading content was created using non-AI tools. And AI tools were not always employed to create such content. But as we also kind of said, this does not mean that that they did not promulgate misleading narratives or acts as visual cues to radical online networks. So that did kind of occur during these elections. And so we're kind of working on this as a more fully fledged academic paper. We're also, as I said, finalizing a content analysis in the run-up to these elections on the kind of media discourse, and also looking more at the kind of visual aesthetic aspects of these of this content that we found. So thank you, and I'm open to kind of ask some more or answer some questions.
Thank you for this presentation. It's really interesting, because I think that we don't talk enough about visual misinformation. So everyone that is listening, don't hesitate to react or ask questions in the dedicated space in the chat. There is already one reaction, one question about the credibility of misinformation. So Bart, when you evaluated the credibility of misinformation, for you, what kind of aspects made the difference between credible and non-credible items?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that is obviously, there's also always a kind of subjective aspect to that. But the credibility, or kind of the category of credible, is that you, like, for example, the hoax of Donald Trump kind of visiting the it was, I think, a natural disaster. That is clearly kind of something visual, but where you look at it and you think like, yeah, this could be real. This could have been, that this could have happened. Where it's kind of mildly or kind of less credible, but still somewhat. It was kind of like more that you had to look twice in a way. Kind of looked that it was like in the first instance, yeah, but then it kind of, so there weren't kind of like specific guidelines we used. It was kind of more a sense, and then we kind of we had different people examining the same content to make sure that we had agreement on credible, less credible, and not credible, and not credible was like, yeah, often also a lot of these AI, you can kind of like, it's like there was a story in France, for example, of the Seine being polluted. It was also during the Olympics, I think, or prior to the Olympics, and then you had a lot of content of Macron or kind of like people swimming in the Seine and things like that were clearly not credible. So it's a good question, and it's obviously there is some level of judgment there that is being made, that is partly subjective, which we try to mitigate by having different coders coding the same material.
And yeah, I think it's interesting because on the example you showed, of course, we can see the differences, but I guess that in some situation it's not that easy. But as you said in the presentation, and as experts said, and I think different other studies said, the question of the credibility is not that important at the end if it doesn't affect the circulation. I have a question about the credibility also. Did you check in the circulation if there were like some meta discourses or counter narratives about the credibility on information. So maybe some people saying that this is not true content, this is fake news, etc. Or you didn't check that for this specific research?
We didn't necessarily. I mean, what we mainly did was collect instances of things that were circulating, not necessarily looking at comments, but obviously, certainly in the kind of more left-wing sphere, what you did get is sometimes reposting of things. Like, for example, in the data, we also found some kind of anti-immigrant discourses circulating on the left, but that meant that they were using it and reposting it to contest it or to kind of expose it or kind of like, and there you did obviously also see kind of instances of, oh, this is AI generated, or this is, and also in some of the kind of like, certainly in the French context, I think there was also, and Belgium to some extent as well, there was also misinformation circulating on the other ideological side using AI and calling that out. And so there was some kind of instances, but also the kind of, it also speaks to a broader issue in terms of obviously fighting these things, is that if from a kind of more progressive liberal perspective, let's say, you start sharing these forms of misinformation to contest it, that you are obviously also feeding the beast. You are feeding the algorithm. You are making sure that the visual misinformation is shared more, and the algorithm will pick up on that. So there is also kind of a danger and a question in terms of how we contest these things online, in terms of pushing back against them, because if the end result is then that we kind of are making these things trend even more, it kind of defeats the purpose of critiquing it. So that's a kind of side note that I would want to make in terms of reacting on these things and circulating them from an opposing ideological perspective.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, because when you showed that table about the sharing, the fact that, for example, the left, the people that were considered as left had 5% of anti-immigration, Islamophobia discourses. That's kind of high. So I guess it's about that sharing and that maybe countering narratives, but at the same time playing the game of the circulation through social networks. About circulation again, is there a threshold? Did you take like the sample based on the sharing and the circulation, or was it randomly done?
No, I mean, I said our data set is not exhaustive, but we were exhaustive in terms of collecting what we could find during the period of analysis on these accounts that we were following, and so it's also kind of like we didn't necessarily take into account, oh, this only was shared by so many people, but this had kind of a big exposure. Not necessarily, no. We didn't kind of factor that in.
And another question from the chat is about the AI agents, and the question is, how prepared are we for the use of next generation of super powerful and amplifying AI agents in the information domain?
Yeah, I mean, that is a good question. I think there was a lot of, and we can maybe remember this, a lot of hype, a lot of, I would say to some extent, media panic, let's say, that was created around AI and the elections into 2024. There was also a lot of security, like I said, a lot of security agencies, a lot of kind of fears of Russia and China intervening and using these things. At the same time, we will also see that these two, and that didn't really materialize. certainly not in Europe, and I think we can all agree on that. Those fears did not necessarily materialize. But these tools are obviously becoming more and more performant, more and more powerful in terms of what they can generate. And the question then obviously also, and that's also something that I didn't necessarily discuss in this presentation, but that obviously is also of concern to a lot of us that are studying this. What should the reaction be? And I already kind of said some of the reactions might make it even worse than it is. So we need to kind of have that reflection on terms of how can we detect these things, how can we flag these things, what is the responsibility of social media platforms in countering this? Is it enough to have just kind of flagging things? Is it also about removing certain content? How does that then speak to freedom of speech? And also the other aspect that I kind of that this study reveals is that certainly in the UK and US context, there's also a lot of satire and linked with slander and this. So what is the threshold in terms of where we intervene as a democracy, as a society? Because like the one that is here on the screen in terms of same circus, different clown, that is legitimate kind of. I mean, so there is kind of a debate to be had in terms of humor, satire, misinformation, disinformation, and the kind of overlaps between them, because we wouldn't want to kind of stifle the use of humor or in politics, for example. But obviously it gets intertwined with disinformation, misinformation, anti-Muslim rhetoric, racism, etc. So yeah, there is kind of a gray area and a gray zone there that I think we should kind of reflect more on.
Yeah, and talking about racism, anti-Islam discourses, Islamophobia, etc. So one of the champions is Belgium. Maybe we can focus a bit about Belgium. I have 2 questions. The first question is, Belgium is quite complicated as a political divided country. So did you check the information based maybe on the language to see if it was trying to focus more on the Flemish part or on the French speaking part? And I have another question from the chat about the fact that the media critique is much more higher in Belgium. So do you have like insights or ideas of why is it the case?
We did for Belgium. We did make 4 accounts. So we did a kind of Dutch-speaking left-right and a French-speaking left-right. Obviously, we didn't, because the data was so limited for Belgium of what we found. We didn't kind of split it up in kind of Dutch-speaking Belgium and French-speaking Belgium. But obviously, I mean, my sense was that it was more circulating on the Dutch speaking, and the obviously we all know that extreme right is much more active and powerful and financially powerful in the north than it is in the south. So that certainly came out. And also the kind of anti-Muslim was also stronger in the north than it was in the south. The media critique was obviously also came above all from the right or in the right wing kind of spheres kind of it's similar discourses as in the US, kind of fake news, that kind of idea of the media is a kind of evil actor and shouldn't be trusted, and so that's where I think it was above all there that media critique was situated in the Belgian context.
And yeah, talking about the political position, we talk a lot about the right, the radical right, the left, the radical left. In your study, how did you define the political position? I think, for example, of France, when there is always a debate on how, for example, La France Insoumise is considered as a radical left or not, and at the same time, the radical right for some people is normalized and be seen less as radical in the media landscape. So, how did you define them in your study?
I mean, I did say kind of radical right, radical left, but obviously, again, we looked more at kind of like for example, and that's obviously in the North Belgian context, there is NVA, which is not necessarily radical left, but has elements in their party that are radical or are extreme right or kind of close to, and there's obviously also a historical kind of, we don't need to go into that, but you are right to kind of point out that these boundaries and obviously in general ideology today is a kind of a much more complicated minefield, where parts of the, let's say, mainstream right are kind of more and more verging towards into kind of extreme right territory in terms of their discourse, and similarly we could maybe see similar things on the left, maybe less pronounced, but in terms of demarcation, we more looked at particular figures, particular influencers that we could follow on these platforms, parties obviously, or party figures, rather than kind of have clear definitions of this is where we are not. We were more interested in gathering as much examples of things circulating than only looking at this party or this person or this sphere versus and excluding others. So that was maybe how we approached it.
And there is a question in the chat about the question of can we see this visual misinformation as a threat? Is it a menace for election? It seems that it's not that much the case for now. And the question related to that is, what are the big media houses, maybe the mainstream media, doing to tackle this problem? Should they do something? Can they do something?
Yeah. What was the first question again?
It was about is it seen as a menace or a threat?
Yeah. The way that the threat was identified and expressed did maybe not materialize, but that doesn't mean, and that was kind of maybe also the thrust of our argument, is that it doesn't. It can still be a threat to our democratic politics and values without it being necessarily realistic or aligned with the way the threat was conceived or put forward. So in other words, I think in general, misinformation, disinformation is a threat to the democratic process, and that then leads to the follow-up question in terms of what to do about it and what the role of particularly mainstream media organizations is in this regard. Like I said, I already kind of pointed out that there is a responsibility here for these platform companies. They have always maintained the line that we are like telephone operators and we cannot be responsible for the content that circulates on our platforms, which is the kind of classic way of saying, but at the same time, we all acknowledge that they are social media, and media, mainstream media or legacy media as it's called now, has to abide by certain kind of deontological codes, and there is kind of also an expectation of checking sources and things like that. So I don't see why we cannot have the same normative and moral and deontological expectations of social media companies of doing the same. And of course, some of them have been doing more than others. Some have rolled back their kind of capacity to be able to control what is circulating on their networks. The other thing is obviously focusing on media literacy amongst users, but that's also, I think, often a way of saying, oh, the big companies don't have to do anything as long as we put the responsibility on individuals to educate themselves and to see through these things. And then there's the media, or legacy media or mainstream media, who have already, who in the last decade or so have kind of stepped up and done the fact checking, but we also see the limitations of that today, of fact checking, which doesn't mean that we should stop doing this. On the contrary, but we should also reflect on why. Because going back again to that issue of credibility and how if it's uncredible, it can still be damaging, because there are a lot of people out there for whom facts do not matter anymore, or veracity or objectivity, or that are just looking for content that just reinforces their prejudices or reinforces the conspiracy theories that they already believe in, etc., etc. And so that kind of misinformation and disinformation kind of just reinforces that, and it's difficult. It's like difficult for media to operate in that context, but I still think they have an important role to play. And what probably should also be the focus of legacy media is to work on the low levels of trust that journalists and the media have. And that is obviously also the previous question about media critique and the kind of ideas of fake news that is also feeding that distrust. So there is work to be done, I think, to kind of increase the trust of journalists, of media organizations, to play their democratic role and raise those levels of trust again. But like I said, it's easier said than done.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because the role of the fact checkers in a situation where the credibility and the reality is not that important. I was thinking, sometimes I think about the fact that maybe they could focus less about fact checking, even if it's still important, and more about the denunciation of the narratives and maybe the cultural wars or the way those narratives are reinforced. So could it be some ways of seeing the evolution of fact-checking becoming a narrative, denunciating or something like this?
No, I think that's a good point. I think that is, and that needs to go further than fact-checking, but also bringing a counter narrative in a way, and that also kind of, and that's kind of a broader debate that we probably should have in terms of defending democracy and the role of journalists and the role of the legacy media in that our old kind of way of looking at journalists of looking at objectivity on one side and the other side and this and that, and we need to be kind of like that in certain of these kind of battles and fights that we are that are existential for our democratic societies, for example, maybe there shouldn't be a room of on the one hand and the other hand. Like, for example, if we are talking about climate change and 99.5% of scientists say this is happening and this is having an enormous impact, and the 0.4 are all paid by the fossil industries that are saying the contrary. Maybe there is a case to be made that we shouldn't, and some media are already doing that we shouldn't have this kind of like on the one hand, on the other hand.
Yeah, I think that's really important to think about the disposition of objectivity of journalism in general. About the study, I was thinking about situation where elections were possibly more influenced by social media than it is in the sampled countries you had. We had some examples in the last months of candidates that can appear in some elections really pushed by social media, and I think it would be really interesting to see the role of visual misinformation in that situation. Is it something maybe you plan to do, or something that could be doable?
And what kind of countries are you referring to? Kind of more in the global south, or in?
Yeah, I can also talk about Global South now, because there was a comment and a question in the chat about FIMI in Africa, and someone was saying that there the visual disinformation is often employed due to low literacy rates of target audience. Yeah. Some situation can appear when some candidates appear in the Eastern Europe, for example. There was this situation when it, yeah, and so maybe it could be interesting. And just I will ask the question from that commentators also about why do we see the use of visual misinformation more by right-wing accounts in the countries that you studied? Why is it more the right wing? I think that it's most of the time the case when we talk about misinformation, right?
Yeah, because obviously from a right wing, and maybe we should kind of specify things and call them out for what they are, a fascist right wing kind of perspective, truth and objectivity and facts are a nuisance. And I don't want to say that there isn't on the left also some kind of like twisting of the truth to kind of reinforce a certain kind of left-wing message, but my sense is that is much less the case. And from a right-wing perspective, there's much more an agenda of a kind of and a project also of normalizing fascist values and fascist kind of ideas increasingly, and misinformation is part of that kind of what in extreme right context is called metapolitics, which from a left-wing perspective is basically the Gramscian idea of counter-hegemony and the kind of moral entrepreneurs that kind of work through media and education, and to kind of normalize what was previously considered aberrant. And of course, we see that is been quite successful from extreme right perspective and so they are much more invested in kind of creating this fake world and thereby also much more active in terms of circulating misinformation, because they require that to realize their agenda of normalizing what only a few years ago was considered to be disgusting and on the fringe of society. And so, yeah, I think that's might be part of the reason why visual misinformation is circulating much more on the right. And also, to be fair, they have also, and I think the left and center politics is catching up in that regard in recent year, 2 years. But the extreme right has been much more savvy and is pouring almost all of its resources into social media exposure and targeting. And so, because from their perspective the fake media doesn't give them attention, they focus all their attention on using these platforms to circulate disinformation and misinformation and get their talking points salient. I think that's also maybe part of the reason.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Again, the fact that we talk about visual misinformation, because there is also all the maybe the semiotics aspect of the image and the video, etc. So there is a comment about some general reflection about the way of thinking realism also, like in a fact checker's perspective, it's all about the facts. But maybe we have to think about more about realism with other dimensions, such as feeling, emotion, maybe an embodiment of what is realism. So yeah, it opens a lot of window. Maybe we won't open them today because it's the end. Maybe a short word about that, and then we will finish the discussion.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, I think it's a good observation. One thing that I did find interesting in terms of doing the interviews is that one French person that was doing fact-checking, or kind of fact-checking organization, also made the interesting point that because if you tell people it's fake news, what you are, or it's kind of it's a lie, it's like you're wrong, basically, people will go into a defensive mode and will say, well, I'm not wrong. But they were saying a much more powerful tactic to undermine that is to show people that they are being manipulated, and who is manipulating them, and which information and how is that manipulation is being rather than focusing on the fact or non-fact, kind of more looking at sources and tracing things back to maybe Russian sites or whatever, and show people that they're being manipulated. And people don't like being told that they're wrong, but people do mind that they're being manipulated. And if you can show them who is manipulating them and in what way, that might be a more effective way than fact or non-fact.
Yeah, and people that always lie or spread misinformation, for example, in the political field, maybe the journalists have to emphasize on this. Like every time they talk, they say it is renowned political actors that use misinformation in most of its discourse. I think maybe it's some kind of solution. So thank you for this presentation again, Bart, and for all these really interesting answers, and thanks for everyone for being part of the discussion. So we look forward to seeing you at our next session. It will be in December. And in between, there will be a workshop, EDMO BELUX workshop in Luxembourg at the end of October, and more information will be sent soon. So have a nice week, and thank you again. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks.